Good evening, everybody. I'm going to call the East Lansing regular city council meeting of Tuesday, September 10, 2019 to order. Mr. Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
Councilmember Byer?
Here.
Councilmember Draheim?
Here.
Councilmember Stevens?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Altman?
Here.
Mayor Meadows?
Here. The next item on our agenda is approval of the agenda. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved by Councilmember Draheim, seconded by Councilmember Stevens. Any changes? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Next item on the agenda is first the approval of the minutes from the August 13, 2019 meeting. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
Move approval.
Second.
It's been moved by the Mayor Pro Tem and seconded by Councilmember Draheim. Any changes to those minutes? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. And then the approval of the minutes from the September 3rd, 2019 meeting. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved.
Second.
It's been moved by Councilmember Stevens, seconded by Councilmember Byer. Any changes to those? All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. The next item on our agenda is really an announcement, and I hope people are noticing we have a different format for the agenda on the website, which I think gives you better or quicker access to a number of things. But in any event, our written communications are posted. All written communications are posted on the website, and you can see anything that council has received in the last week. The next item on our agenda is communications from persons in the audience. This is a time we set aside for anybody to come to the microphone and talk about anything on or off the agenda. I do have some blue cards here that I think want to be called at the time of the conversion therapy discussion and the ordinance 1458 Evergreen discussion. Ralph, did you want to wait till we get to the public hearing on that?
How long do you think the consent agenda is going to take?
As long as George spends talking about it, but not very long.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. All right. So this is the time to come forward, and anybody, just fill out a blue card after you're done so that the clerk knows who is here. Okay.
All right.
Go ahead.
My name is Liz Miller. I live at 1521 East Grand River Avenue. I'm the pastor of Edgewood United Church on Hagedorn. I'm here to speak in favor of banning conversion therapy practices in East Lansing. As a pastor in a progressive Christian church, it seems like once a month that I get a phone call from a young adult or a youth who has experienced these in our community. And they have been told that in order to be Christian, that they cannot be queer and they need to change. And these kids are full of shame. They are depressed, they are isolated, and they are in our community. And I've always been a part of progressive churches and moved to East Lansing, believes surely this does not happen here. And I can tell you from the testimonies of youth in our community that it does happen in here. There are a lot of shadowy corners in East Lansing that we're not taking notice of, and the folks who are being impacted don't often have the power to speak out for themselves. So this isn't some hypothetical feel good, we're going to condemn it and feel good about ourselves ordinance. This is something that is impacting real lives of youth right here in our city. So I'm asking you to full on ban the conversion therapy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments.
Hi, my name is Talise Murray. I live at 500 South Harrison Road, and I am the chair of the Human Relations Commission for the City of East Lansing. The Human Relations Commission is the body tasked with protecting the human rights of this city in our protected classes. And we, over 50 years ago, as a city, spoke loudly and boldly when we became one of the two first cities in this country to place LGBTQ rights as a protected class. And so today we need to be just as bold in protecting those rights that we told people of this city that they would have back so long ago, and saying we're going to ban that and protect all the youth in this city from the physical and mental harm that conversion therapy has done to people across the country. We have people that were part of conversion therapy 40 years ago that still deal with the physical and mental scars to this day. We do not get to decide when we do want to protect our protected classes. We made that promise, and that promise is full-heartedly needs to be protected at all times. A simple discouragement does not stop it from happening. Discouragement does not prevent the emotional scars that someone will experience. We spoke out loudly, internationally, to say LGBTQ rights and the mental and physical health of LGBTQ youth and members of our community mattered in a time where no one else really thought they did. And so today, in a society when everyone else is saying that they do, we need to maintain that voice and maintain that strength and do the right thing and ban it completely. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to address council on anything at this time? All right, seeing none, I will, oh, sorry. It's okay.
I apologize, I was a little bit late. I heard a comment back here in regards to the rezoning. Were we gonna wait? Did you ask?
There's a
about-
public hearing on that, so you
So
can wait
now?
until then. You don't
want
have
me
to
to
speak
wait?
right
Okay, I
now.
will
But
absolutely
if you
do
want to
that.
speak right now, you can.
I can wait.
Okay,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Is there anybody else who wishes to address council on anything on or off the agenda? All right, seeing none, the next item on the agenda is communications from council members. Councilmember Byer, anything?
No, thank you.
Councilmember Draheim.
I just want to remind everybody that on September 18th, which is a Wednesday, East Lansing is hosting the East Lansing Talks About Suicide and Self-Harm. It's at 6:00 p.m. in the East Lansing Public Library. This is an event that is meant for adults, teens, and it's meant to be a discussion and a training and a space for people to talk and be connected to resources. And I highly encourage people to go, whether this is something that applies sort of what you think in your life or whether this is people in your extended community. Just knowing more about this and being one of the people in this community who can help support those of us in our community who are suffering from mental health issues. So I think it's going to be a really important event, and I encourage you to go.
Can you say it one more time? when and where it is?
September 18th, it's a Wednesday, 6 p.m. at the East Lansing Public Library. And East Lansing is a partner in this with our Tri-County partners on mental health, as well as the school district. So.
Okay, Councilmember Stevens, anything?
Yes, I have two things. One, I'd just like to give a little bit of an update on hub stuff from before at our discussion only meeting from last week. So they had reached out to us with a plan of action after the fact and outlined a number of steps that they're going to be taking to reach out to different people. I still have the occasional person reaching out to me, and I'd like to thank the media that covered this as well, because I think that's a good reason why people are still reaching out to me with issues. And I've also had hub staff follow up with me after that to try and get in contact with the people that are reaching out to me to maybe get them resources on it. I'll continually provide updates to what I'm hearing on the ground and what's happening. But at the time being, I think they've addressed some of the issues, and they still have a long way to go, but I think steps are being made. And then my next thing is there is going to be a coffee and conversation on September 22nd from 2 to 4 p.m. at Blue Owl. Coffee and conversations are a brainchild of our Human Relations Commission. We believe at the Human Relations Commission that it's our duty to continuously fight for equity and equality in this city, and that means going out and seeking it rather than waiting for it to come to us. And so this issue is going to be on LGBTQIA rights and issues within the city. We've had 3 so far, and they've gone over very, very well. Fairly well attended. It's a fairly laid back conversation just regarding protected classes within our city. So I encourage anybody to come out. Again, that is 2 to 4 p.m. At Blue Owl on September 22nd.
Mr. Mayor Pro Tem,
No
anything?
report, thank you.
And no report from me. The next item on our agenda is the city manager's report. Mr. Lahanas.
Yes, just one item. As you mentioned, Mayor, we have switched over for council meetings to iCompass. So for our residents, you'll just see hopefully a better organized page with an agenda that's laid out differently. Hopefully it is a better user experience for our residents who are trying to follow us here or at home. It should be a little bit more glitch-free than we had a little bit of problems at the end with the Granicus platform. So hopefully this is expected to perform much better when people are using it. I want to thank Emily Gordon, Nicole Bartel, and our video professional staff for helping to implement this over the past 3 months. It was quite a lot of work to get us to this point. Council is on it now, but we expect that Planning Commission and DDA will be following for their next meetings by October to have most of our boards and commissions through the iCompass platform. And people can follow that on any device, mobile device, phones, tablets, or laptops, as well as your home computer, certainly. That's all I have. Thanks.
Okay. Mr. Yaden, anything?
Thank you, Mayor. No report this evening.
Okay. The next item on our agenda then is the consent agenda. Mr. Lahanas.
There we go. So we have the following items on the consent agenda for council's consideration. Approve the following appointments or reappointments to boards and commissions. A, Thassin Sardar to the Human Relations Commission for a partial term ending December 31st, 2020. B, Veta Hawkins to the Elected Officers Compensation Commission for a full term ending December 31st, 2026. C, John Zarnecki to the Elected Officers Compensation Commission for a partial term ending December 31st, 2021. D, Sarah Pricer to the Elected Officers Compensation Commission for a full term ending December 31st, 2026. Item 3.2, approve amendments to the Historic District Commission bylaws. 3.3, approve the Humana Medicare Advantage Plan renewal for 2020 and authorize the city manager to sign. Item 3.4, approve the purchase of handheld emergency radios for Department of Public Works, DPW, in the amount of $46,890, and to authorize the city manager to sign. Item 3.5, approve fiscal year 2017 SRF State Revolving Fund contingency allocation and authorization for work change directives and change orders. 3.6, approve the settlement agreement between the City of East Lansing and the Police Officers Association of Michigan, POAM, and authorize the city manager to sign the agreement. 3.7, approve the professional engineering services agreement from Tetra Tech Incorporated for the fiscal year 2021 through fiscal year 2025 SRF State Revolving Fund project plan at a cost of $79,900 and authorize the city manager to sign. 3.8, approve change order number 2 in the amount of $124,008.96 and change order number 3 in the amount of $464,921.17 to the Michigan Avenue and Harrison Road Sewer Improvements Project and authorize the city manager to sign. Item 3.9, approve the allocation of contingency funds for the fiscal year 19 SRF loan-funded projects, biosolids improvements with digester, Michigan and Harrison sewer improvements, and Woodingham pump station replacement. Item 3.10, set a public hearing for October 8, 2019 to consider a site plan application to modify the approved site plan for the property at 6210 Abbott Road for the construction of 50 two-bedroom residential units in a mix of 3 and 4 unit buildings and the conversion of existing commercial space to 2 residential units. 3.11, set a public hearing for October 8, 2019 to consider Ordinance 1462, an ordinance to amend sections 50-790, 50-791, 50-792, 50-793, and 50-794 of Division 6, East Village District of Article 7, Other Districts of Chapter 50, Zoning of the Code of the City of East Lansing to make changes to certain provisions of the East Village District. 3.12, set a public hearing for October 8, 2019 to consider a modified site plan application from Tailwind East Lansing 3 L.L.C. for the property at 6210 Abbott Road to modify the site plan conditions of approval for the Gaslight Village development to remove the limitation on leasing for periods of less than 2 years. Item 3.13, set a public hearing for October 8, 2018 to consider a site plan and special use permit application from Northern United Brewing Company, L.L.C. to establish a brewery, winery, distillery, and artisan pizza restaurant and bar at 218 Albert Avenue. Item 3.14, Set a public hearing for October 8, 2019 to consider a site plan and special use permit application from Royal Apartments USA and Vlahakis Development for the properties at 314, 328, 334, and 340 Evergreen Avenue for a 9-story, 110-foot tall mixed-use building containing 2 levels of underground parking, 23,008 square feet of commercial space, market on the first floor, 184 market rate and income qualified rental apartments on the upper floors, and realignment and extension of Albert Avenue and associated utility and public plaza improvements. Item 3.15, set a public hearing for October 8, 2019 to consider a special use permit application from Target Corporation for the property at 201 East Grand River Avenue to allow the sale of packaged beer, wine, and spirits for off-premise consumption. Item 3.16, introduce and refer to the Planning Commission Ordinance 1470, an ordinance to rezone 3225 West Road from RA Residential Agricultural District to B2 Retail Sales Business District. 3.17, set a public hearing for October 8, 2019 to consider an application from GTW Investment Properties, L.L.C. for a site plan and special use permit approval for the property at 215 and 217 River Street to construct a 4-story sorority house to house 44 people. Item 3.18, resolution authorizing the city manager to execute deed and related documents for the Merritt Road property sale. Those are all the items on the consent agenda for council's consideration.
All right, does anyone wish any of these items moved to the business agenda? All right, seeing none, is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
A second.
It's been moved by the Mayor Pro Tem, seconded by Councilmember Draheim. Any discussion? I'll just say, get ready for a long night on October 8th. All in favor of the motion, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. The next item on our agenda is a public hearing for consideration of Ordinance 1458, an ordinance to rezone the properties at 314, 328, 334, and 340-344 Evergreen Avenue from RM32 City Center Multiple Family Residential District to B3 City Center Commercial District. David, before you go, I want to get some testimony from the audience.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Ralph, I do have a blue card from you. If you want to step out now, you can talk about this.
I just wanted to bring up a map before we get started, if that's okay.
Okay. There we go.
Excuse me.
You're up, Ralph.
Thank you. I've been thinking about this for a while, and some of you have heard these comments before in terms of different meetings around the city, especially at the DDA and the Planning Commission. I'm here to basically ask you not to go to the B3 for this particular area. And it's on the basis of the discussion that has occurred with regard to the Royal Properties and Mr. Vlahakis, and also with the work necessary to do a RFP. It's also tied to the issue of the claustrophobia, I would almost say, from the development that Royal Properties have put together, and the change that it would make in terms of Valley Court, Oakland neighborhood, buildings along Abbott in terms of their livability. And one of the things that East Lansing is trying to do at all times, by the way, I have a document here that I'll provide to you, or if you want it now, but there's been a lot of discussion about this, and I don't want to carry on for a long time, but the basic scenario is that when you get into that particular area, the infrastructure, the way the buildings are laid out, the way the roads go, the connections to Oakwood neighborhood, the buildings along Abbott, we've had several opportunities to try to do this thing over the years. Most of them have just ground to a halt. This is a little bit different in terms of it's the first time that it wrapped totally around the AT&T building. Maybe there was a proposal at one point that did that, but the other scenario is what is going to happen to Valley Court, what is going to happen to the farmers market. There's been a lot of discussion, and I don't want to necessarily use Royal Oaxacas as the bad boy here, but it certainly did bring to attention a lot of issues that are very difficult to deal with in this particular case, and making infrastructure difficult to handle. We also have a program with the B3 where you have to have essentially on the bottom floor, for the most part, mixed use in terms of office or a lot of times it's retail, and those have often remained vacant. There isn't any real ability to fill them, and we're already adding a lot more of that in the current buildings that are going on in East Lansing. And you are still looking at some buildings that have those vacancies from years ago. I also want to say that one of the things that's on the table, maybe it's more tied to the East Village discussion, but if we're building a whole bunch of buildings at this point in time with the building codes for this era, and we're going into global warming issues and looking forward as contrasted to looking back, are we in fact at a good point in terms of making decisions relative to how these things are constructed, how they're set up for a variety of different things, fire, tornadoes, water, that sort of thing. And we maybe should be thinking of this in a whole different way, and I'm hoping that the Michigan Municipal League is doing that too. Another thing that's coming all of the time is parking and the cost of parking structures. When you go underground, those things double, and when you build all of these buildings in a clustered place and there isn't a room for people to get to, you have problems with regard to traffic. We've had a whole bunch of discussions about how we can have traffic impact statements made for each of these programs, and often the Oakwood neighborhood is sort of a guinea pig in terms of, okay, we'll build this thing and then we'll come back to you 2 years later and say, did it work or didn't it work, or are you having all kinds of problems? Traffic on Abbott, Albert, and Grand River is problematic at key times. Just now, as I came from Pinecrest, I came down Abbott, and the backup was past the church up here, even beyond that. And that's a situation which it seems to me this development isn't going to improve. And many of you have talked about this issue for years. So, and in fact, some of the changes that were made to Abbott, which made it 2 lanes and maybe a little bit more understandable in terms of getting downtown, but it also led to delays in terms of that process. Adding more people coming is going to increase that. Multi-use has been something that we've tried to do, but what it mainly well, over time, it gets to the point where you replicate restaurants, liquor license, shops, and pushing that into the Valley Court Park neighborhood, it seems to me, really causes questions about place and viability. I share the concerns expressed by the Planning Commission regarding the Oaxacas Royal Department development, but again, the same thing would happen with anybody who's coming in here if they're trying to meet the conditions that are here in order to build the building. I mean, they're giving us a dry run in terms of how much it costs to build a building there, at least the building of the size that they're talking about. So why not just be reasonable and basically say that they've had a good go at it, but let's think about the fact that a conditional rezoning might be a halfway point, but leaving the thing the way it is for Evergreen in terms of the RM32 may well be the best choice. And let's keep this thing simple so that people are not always being confronted with all of this building. I know our Pinecrest neighborhood as a group are not interested in big buildings downtown. In fact is, at our most recent meeting, that was a common theme that came up in terms of our noticing them about this particular meeting. I must admit I was out of town and wasn't paying much attention, and so our neighborhood did not get a notice about that, and I'm sorry for that particular thing. But I could name a few names in terms of people who in the past have come for that. Now, you'll hopefully get a copy of this document, and again, you are doing a wonderful work as persons representing the city of East Lansing. We very much thank you for your services. We're looking for a progressive, forward-thinking city and making this place livable and a place that people want to come to. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. Is there anybody else in the audience who wishes to address council?
Hi there again. Here's my card. My name is Jody Cook. I am at 10175 Corcoran Road in Hazlitt. I'm here as a representative to the People's Church. I hope I did send a letter out. I hope everybody did receive it.
We got it.
I just wanted to come here in person and just vocalize and reinforce that the People's Church is also aware of the rezoning and are opposed to it for many of the reasons that you have already heard. I won't take your time. But would just ask that we just wait to see what we receive. We're absolutely excited about welcoming new neighbors and looking forward to working with whomever gets that property across the way there. But we just would like to see a wait on a rezone to see exactly what is proposed or approved and kind of eliminate hoops in the future.
And just so I'm clear on my notes here, you would prefer to see the RFP go out and find out what comes in before we would do any rezoning with regard to this?
Yeah, we just don't know why we need to do it right now. If we're opposed, let's keep it open and see who comes in and what we receive, and then if there is down the road or a conditional as was previously stated, I think that would be an alternative if it comes to that. But I think we would like to wait.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anybody else? All right, seeing none, I'll close the public hearing on that and bring it back to council. Or are there any questions of staff before we have a motion on this? Go ahead.
Is
David,
gonna-
can you step up here?
Good evening.
Hi, David. So I have a couple questions. One is, somebody asked me this, and I hadn't really been thinking about it, but we've always, when we've changed the zoning around for this set of properties conditionally, I think probably because they have been all part of a project, we've lumped all of those projects together. So 314 all the way down. But do we have to do that? If we are considering a rezoning, and maybe this is a question for Tom as much as you, but if we're considering rezoning, can we separate these out? I recognize that they're all DDA properties and we have a DDA request in front of us, but the DDA could request, we could look at these separately, could we not?
Certainly.
Okay. Not that I think we necessarily should, I'm just trying to get my hands around sort of the process of it. And then my question for you, David, is can you give us a little bit of an update on where we are with the form-based codes? Because I'm trying to kind of think of this in the context of that process. And
Yeah, so the committee continues to meet. I think we've got a couple more work sessions before we bring it back to the Planning Commission. Although the Planning Commission is starting to get chunks of the document as the first few sections are completed, or at least completed enough to bring it back to the Planning Commission. And then they're continuing to work on other components of it. So it's still a work in progress. But it is migrating toward the Planning Commission. So we're looking for some public input sessions to be coming in the not too distant future, October, November.
Okay.
And then from there, once we get some consensus from the Planning Commission as a whole, we'll kind of roll that out, deliver it to the council, get some support from council and then try to get some viable public input at that point.
Okay, so potentially coming back to council by the end of the calendar year, somewhere in that
Yeah, potentially.
ballpark-ish
Yep.
timeframe, okay. Okay, and then my other question relates to the, if we were to go out for an RFP with these properties at some point, depending on sort of what happens. So, I mean, to someone, people have made the point both in writing and here, sort of why do we have to do this now? And I'll just note that, if you're going out with an RFP, your current zoning is what's guiding, what's signaling to people what they can and can't do. So we're asking them to respond, but we can't really say respond and, I mean, we could, they could send us anything, but give us something that doesn't fit in our zoning code. So I think that's partly why, but we do have a unique situation here, that we have a current zoning code, we have a master plan that envisions something slightly different for these properties, and then at the which is sort of in the middle, right? So current zoning, sort of what the master plan has is mixed use 3, and then B3, which we could change it to. Could we go out with an RFP that sort of just talks, that just says this, it's currently zoned as this, the master plan envisions it as Y, and just sort of see, I'm a little hesitant because I get what the quandary puts us in, but I also, and that we're in the middle of doing a form-based code. So that if people really did want to think about and be creative and come in with something that they think fits within that parameter, they at least could consider that. Now that's their risk, right? They may put together a whole proposal and then we go, oh, we're not changing it, it's gonna be RM32. But is there a reason why we couldn't, procedurally or legally do that?
I mean, there's no reason why we couldn't. I mean, we could slice that anyway, but I think it's pretty clear that the DDA wanted to market this property pretty heavily, and the best way to do that from their perspective is to go after B3 because it's the most permissive, it creates the most density and that kind of thing. So I think from their perspective, that's what they would prefer because it would market the property and get the highest return on it, right? And that's the theory there, but I mean, you could, if they so choose, or you wanted to rezone it a different way, I mean, that could be an option, although the request tonight is B3, but I guess as we move forward, we could look at those options to see what's viable in that regard, but each one has a consequence to go in one direction or the other, so yeah, it is a unique situation for sure.
Okay, those are my questions.
Go ahead.
And what would the zoning be if it were to conform to the master plan?
So the master plan, talks about, so it's M3, mixed use 3, and it's analogous to, it's six stories, 84 feet, and it equates it to the B2 district, right? So it actually uses that district as a most analogous to type terminology, but B2 right now, as B2 is designed, is 4 stories, 64 feet. It does allow for up to 6 stories or 84 feet, but that only comes when you have a site that's 2 acres or larger. Is it 2 acres or is it 3 acres? Yeah, 2 acres or larger. So this site is only just over an acre, all combined. So if you were to look at B2 as being most compatible with the master plan, you wouldn't get height, you'd be limited to 4 stories.
So there's nothing between what we have now and B3 that we could change it to right now?
Correct. So, yeah, so the problem there is that the site size. And so that's another option, I suppose, is to look at B2, amend that code for certain zone to allow for a little bit more height closer to downtown, that kind of thing. That could be an option. But that goes back to the unique situation scenario, where it just seems like everywhere you turn, there's a little bit of a unique spin on this.
Any other questions? I've got just a question for you, because my memory is that actually, just for the record, the proposal that Mr. Vlahakis and Royal had put forward was an RM32 proposal. It was 120 feet, correct? And that is permitted with a special use permit in that zone?
For the current site?
For the current site, and the plan that they actually put in does not require B3 zoning.
I think they were assuming that they would get up zone, yeah.
Okay, I didn't actually see that there. And that's all I had for you. So,
Okay, thank you.
all right, is there, I think we need a motion on this in order to move forward one way or the other. Go ahead.
So moved. Okay.
Okay, so moved works. And that would be a motion to approve ordinance number 1458, an ordinance to rezone the properties at 314, 328, 334, and 340-344 Evergreen Avenue from RM32 City Center Multiple Family Residential District to B3 City Center Commercial District. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, seconded by Councilmember Draheim. Discussion.
Can I speak to my motion?
Yes, absolutely.
So I moved this just so you can talk about it, but I won't be supporting it in its current form. That isn't Center City, that area. It's between the Center City and the neighborhoods in the park. And so we need something between that, which is what I was hoping I could amend it to tonight, but it doesn't look like there is a good option for now. So I think we should wait until we have something that speaks to stepping down from the city center. I don't mind so much on Abbott, but coming down on Evergreen, I think there needs to be a decline. So that's why I won't be supporting it.
Okay. Anybody else? Discussion? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I want to just, a couple points. I mean, on the one hand, I like the idea of changing the zoning permanently, right? A master plan guides the zoning, guides the site plan approval. And I have not really liked that we keep doing conditional zoning for projects. So on a process standpoint, I would like this to work, but it doesn't sort of match what we have very well. So unless we could figure out a way to sort of tweak or amend B2, or unless we make some presumptions about where the form-based codes might go, and I was going to ask David another question, just because I want to make sure that captures all of those properties. I know it captures some of them, which was part of my question,
Right.
but
Gotcha.
because I agree. I think at the base level, B3, sort of 4 stories, if it's no residential component, but it could potentially, if it has a residential component, which I actually think is more appropriate there, it could go up to 6 stories, and that feels like that isn't doing what it needs to do to slope down, particularly when I think of what's sort of slated for that triangle parcel as part of the park district. So I'm also not going to be supporting this.
I'm sorry, I forgot one thing.
Go ahead.
There is a confounding problem with this property is that we owe a lot of money on it, which is one of the reasons to push the zoning up, because you have more leverage that way. But still, I don't think it makes sense to have the height right there, because in the past, we've been able to use the adjoining property to let it go a little bit higher and still find a way to have somebody propose that we pay off that property. We haven't had a successful one yet. But I think we can keep trying, and we can look at the zoning. And I would ask staff to come up with some amendments to B2 that we can propose and look at that would allow us to do what we want to do there without allowing us to do more than we want to do there.
Anybody else? I'll just a couple of comments, because I think I moved this forward from the DDA when I think there was a vote on the DDA, and I'm pretty sure I tend to move things from the DDA to the City Council or the Planning Commission, but I don't intend on voting for this. There's a couple of reasons, a little bit different than others. It's not so much that I worry about what this zoning would do, because I think even for the Convexity project, we've approved conditional rezoning to B3 at this location on a number of occasions, then come back and removed the conditional zoning to when those projects didn't go forward. But I personally think that we have to have the opportunity to conditionally rezone. I don't want to rezone this property permanently and not know what we're going to get proposed for us, because then we're sort of locked into an existing zoning that may restrict our ability to negotiate a better product. And I think we found that to be a tough thing with regard to the latest proposal. And I would prefer that we leave it at RM32 at this point in time. If the RFP comes back with something that we love, then we can take a look at this again and take a look at the appropriate zoning. But I also agree with Ruth. I think we need to see some alternatives to the zoning at this location that might promote a better product on that site. And actually, for all the reasons that Ralph brought up as well, I mean, it's right on the park. We're about to build low to moderate income housing directly across the street from these properties, and it would be nice to have all this compatible in some way going forward. So I'll be voting no on this. All right, if there's no more other comments, all in favor of approving the ordinance, indicate by saying aye. All opposed, same sign. Aye. Okay, it dies. The next item on our agenda is is the business agenda, which is consideration of ordinance 1467, an ordinance prohibiting the practice of conversion therapy. I did have a card from Steve Roscoe's. I've got a card from Talise Murray, but I think she already spoke.
Yes,
So,
she did.
if Steve is here, just step up to the microphone.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Steve Roscoe from Shaw Estates, 935 Longfellow Drive. Wanted to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you and also for the work you do. Appreciate you all working hard to make our city better. I really believe that's your intent, even with this ordinance. I am a family physician and an associate professor at Michigan State, and I'm going to speak against the ordinance. My friend David Shane is going to speak a little longer, and I second what he has to say. But briefly, I would just say that some forms of conversion therapy clearly have been harmful and are even unethical. However, I think the scientific understanding of both homosexuality and transgenderism is rapidly evolving, especially the understanding of how those things happen among youth in adolescence. And so the science hasn't settled, and I think that it's outlawing certain types of therapy for patients with these issues is premature and might prevent patients from receiving therapy that they need or that they want. In addition, I think the City Council is stepping a little bit out of its typical jurisdiction and area of expertise and attempting to regulate the practice of a lot of professions. The law regulates many professions that are already regulated, and I would rather leave that to the state licensing boards. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And David Shane?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so David Shane, 1034 Chesterfield Parkway. I have a 3-minute comment. My wife timed it, so we're good there. Yeah, so I did send a letter actually with Steve Roscoe about this ban to council a couple months ago, which I'm not going to repeat here. But the core point of that letter, which will also be buttressed by the one additional story I did want to share today, is that bans on conversion therapy often effectively function as rules that require counselors to just affirm any gender identity claim that might be brought to them. That actually there are a lot of people speaking out today, actually the more you look, the more stories you find, from people who say they were harmed or harmed themselves by undertaking a physical transition they later came to regret because of this uncritical counseling they received. And so there are actually a lot of data points out there that say that bans on conversion therapy actually result in increased harm to at least some individuals. I wasn't sure what else to say today. There's so many things you could say. I thought I would just read an extended quote from an article published in April in the Federalist, actually, titled "Feminist Pro-Gay Mother of Trans Child Critiques Bans on Conversion Therapy." So it's really worth reading in its entirety, but I just want to quote a small part of the author's personal story. So she said, when my daughter came out as transgender, I wanted to find a therapist who could help her sort out what her gender dysphoria meant. Was she transgender, or was she ashamed of same-sex attraction, reacting to trauma, wanting respect, uncomfortable with feminine stereotypes, or had she internalized hate for women's bodies? Okay, that list is because a lot of people who now formerly identified as transgender would point to one of those issues as the real issue they were struggling with, which they, and often their therapists, misidentified as a gender identity issue. She continues, I quickly discovered it is nearly impossible to find therapists who do this kind of work. If a girl presents as transgender today, the vast majority of therapists will immediately affirm the girl's declared gender identity and ask her what steps she would like to take toward transition. I interviewed a dozen therapists in search of one who could help my daughter examine her feelings and motivations. I finally resorted to paying out of pocket for my daughter to talk online to a therapist who lives in another state. I know I am not alone. I belong to an online support group with nearly 1,500 parents of gender dysphoric youth. Finding therapists who provide standard mental health therapy rather than automatic affirmation is a frustration for most of us. And then especially relevant to the city ordinance here, the goal of anti-conversion therapy bills is to ban mental health therapists from using conversion therapy with minors. I'm afraid these bills will have a chilling effect on therapists' ability to help girls who say they are transgender. What the general public does not understand is that standard mental health therapy is now considered conversion therapy when practiced with gender dysphoric youth. And at the end, my daughter has appreciated the opportunity to think deeply about what her feelings mean and whether transition would be a helpful thing for her. Yet activists who believe in an affirmation-only approach are filing complaints to her therapist licensing board claiming the therapist is practicing conversion therapy. Okay. So the City Council should not make the mistake of conflating what are at least two distinct ideas. If you go back 10 years, there are indeed few people who would defend what was traditionally called conversion therapy as regards sexual orientation. But today, there are many people trying to raise the alarm about modern conversion therapy bans that are really sort of restricting counselors into providing this uncritical counseling that they themselves would say harm them. Okay, and so the city should not incentivize exactly this harm. Thank you.
Question?
Yeah,
Yes,
sorry.
go ahead.
I'm just a physicist, but continue.
Was the daughter cited in this article and quoted?
I did not memorize. I do have the article, but I did not memorize the article, so I can give it to you.
I was just asking because, you know, if they're speaking out against it, and I believe fully that the mother has the daughter's best intentions at heart, but, you know.
You can find. I mean, Eric Altman. I sent also cited in the footnotes for the letter I sent to the city was individuals who personally regret physical transition and say they received uncritical counseling. There are many stories like this. Actually, the Federalist article I found at a website that was just collecting stories of regret, essentially, and this was just one of the links on that page.
Sure.
So, I don't know if that daughter was regretful personally, but many people are for sure.
Thank you for your comment.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.
All right, anybody else? Yes, come right up. Just please fill out one of these blue cards when you're done, okay?
Absolutely. So, my name is Colin Wiebrecht, 707 Prudence Street. I was going to read a statement. I'm also going to respond to some of the fear-mongering about this ordinance. So, conversion therapy assumes that to be LGBTQ or to identify as LGBTQ is something that needs to be fixed or cured. It is not therapy. It's not medicine. It has no basis in any factual treatment. Conversion therapy has and always will be torture of LGBT people, whether physical, psychological, or physiological. It has no basis in any medical or psychological practice, and the history of its use against the LGBT community is despicable and deplorable. Prior methods included chemical castration, physical abuse, including electroshock methods, physical aversion, verbal abuse, and other methods. The number one indicator for mental health of LGBT folks after coming out is whether or not their family accepts them. Minors who are forced into conversion therapy need and deserve our protection. If their parents aren't capable of loving and accepting their children as they are, we must step up as a city to keep them safe and to tell them there's nothing wrong with them as members of the LGBT community. Children have a solid sense of their gender identity by around ages 4 to 6. Coming out as LGBTQ is as simple as identifying personally or publicly or vocally to others as LGBTQ. That includes if you come out as transgender. Also, transgenderism is not the proper word. Coming out as trans does not mean that you are automatically going to start taking hormones. It does not mean that you're going to undergo gender confirmation surgery. Some that come out as trans just want to identify as trans or gender non-binary. There's this great fear that kids are just going to automatically come out as trans and say, oh, I'll go on hormones tomorrow. That's not what happens. There's a process that counselors have to go through to confirm that the child wishes to go through with this. A lot of the conversion therapy, well, actually, let me go to that article for a second. So, I can't confirm this, but just from listening to it, it sounded like the mother was talking about her daughter, who, if they're identifying as trans, it would be her son, not her daughter. And she kept referring to her daughter with female pronouns, which is misgendering someone that identifies as male. That is like the number one most disrespectful thing that someone can do to someone that's trans. And regardless of whether the article says that the mother is pro-gay and feminist, that doesn't mean that you're going to understand trans issues or be pro-trans. There's a large group of, they're called radical feminists, but I don't personally consider them feminists. They're known as trans exclusionary radical feminists. But if your feminism is not inclusive of trans women, then it's not feminism, because feminism is supposed to be inclusive and encompassing of all identities. As well as with the first speaker, LGBT identities were referred to as these issues. And I think it would really be interesting to ask anyone against this ordinance what their personal beliefs are when it comes to being LGBT. If they believe that it's morally wrong or reprehensible in some way, because I think that that answer would likely give you the information that there's a reason that they're against it, and it's because they believe, just like those that promote conversion therapy, that there's something wrong with people that are LGBT. That's the whole basis of conversion therapy. And for minors to be forced through it because their parents don't understand who they are, that's awful. And so I think that we need to do more than just pass a resolution against it, and we need to actually ban it in the city. And East Lansing is a city that has a history of standing up for the LGBT community. In 1973, I believe, we were the first city to pass an ordinance protecting LGBT folks from discrimination in employment. Second, sorry. Anyway, but one of the first, and certainly far ahead of the state of Michigan, because the state of Michigan still is not protected or added these protections to L.L.C. And that's all I have, and I'll fill one of these out for you.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Did you have a question?
No, I was going to make a motion.
Okay, second.
I don't think we're done with the, are you done with all the cards?
I'm done with all the cards.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I want to make sure that nobody else in the audience wishes to address us on this. But I have a question to Tom, if you don't mind, before we...
I'd like to make a motion, and can we do it during discussion?
I think once we're in discussion mode, probably shouldn't be asking staff for, I just want to ask him about the ordinance. There was a point made up here, I just want to clarify, that talked about maybe we're overstepping our bounds by essentially limiting this to providers and then defining medical professionals as those provider licensed individuals within the state of Michigan. I want to make sure we're not overstepping our bounds, so I want to just get that from you as we go forward.
Not from my perspective, no.
Okay, all right.
I also have 2 questions, Tom.
Sure, go ahead.
If you look at the ordinance, section 2263 definitions on page 2A, the definition.
Yep.
Does this imply that it's forced? So my problem is this says conversion therapy means any practice or treatment that seeks to change an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity, including efforts to change behaviors or gender expressions or to eliminate or reduce sexual or romantic attractions or feelings toward individuals of the same gender. If somebody goes to a therapist and wants to do that, would that be illegal under this ordinance? Or should it say against their will, kind of? Should there be some language in there implying that it's forced?
Well, I think you have to read that first provision in conjunction with the second, which states that what conversion therapy does not include, which says counseling that provides support and assistance to a person undergoing gender transition, or counseling that provides acceptance, support, and understanding of a person or facilitates a person's coping, social support and development, including sexual orientation, neutral interventions to prevent or address unlawful conduct or unsafe practices, as long as counseling does not seek to change sexual orientation or gender identity. So
That's my whole point. If I go to a counselor and say, I would like to change my sexual identity or change my gender identity, or I don't want neutral treatment, I want you to give me, one side and the other. I guess that's one way to do neutral, is to counsel 2 different ways. But if I, as a patient, a 16, a 17, or an 18-year-old, have a desire of my own, to have some effect on my own feelings about myself, which could be grounded in other things, I wouldn't know maybe, because my frontal lobe is not yet developed. I couldn't do that in East Lansing then?
Under this ordinance, I don't believe so, because if it's the practice of conversion therapy, it would still be banned under these provisions. And I think the ordinance kind of presumes that persons under 18 years of age need to have that banned at this point. If you turn 19, it wouldn't be banned. But I think the ordinance makes a presumption that that person doesn't have enough of a will of their own to understand the harmful effects of conversion therapy.
So while we're working on this, can you work on an amendment that I could add to this that says something about it being against the will of the patient?
Sure.
Thanks. And then sorry, you can't do that quite yet because I have another question. My other question is about enforcement in the ordinance. How is this enforced and what are the penalties?
The enforcement would start with a complaint that goes to the Human Relations Commission, and they would investigate whether there was a violation, and at the conclusion of that investigation, they can either find that no violation occurred, or they can make a advisory letter to the provider advising them of this ordinance and the provisions and the illegality, or alternatively request a civil infraction citation from our office for our office to authorize one. We wouldn't actually issue it, but we'd authorize an officer to issue a civil infraction citation. And then there's a number of other actions that they can take that the Human Relations Commission can take under their general ordinances. But the municipal civil infraction, if that process was started and the person was found responsible for that, it'd be a maximum fine of $1,000 plus a maximum court cost of $500 under the general civil infraction provisions of our code.
So unlike other kinds of child abuse, this would not be investigated by the police?
Correct.
Okay, can you work on another amendment that would make this, violating this, similar to other kinds of child abuse?
There's a number of different levels of child abuse. I'm assuming you're talking about it like a misdemeanor level then? Because we obviously don't have, the maximum penalty we can enforce by ordinance is, under a criminal violation, is 90 days and or $500. So that's the maximum criminal sanction we can enforce under the Home Rule Cities Act.
Okay.
Fines, civil infraction fines are technically unlimited. So if you wanted, if you want to make it a misdemeanor, that's pretty simple to do, then it would go to the maximum fine. If you want to keep it a civil infraction, you can specifically authorize a higher fine.
What I'm trying to do is to have the penalty. I'm thinking about who has to actually investigate this. And the Human Rights Coalition or Human Rights Commission, I don't know that they have the person power to investigate, but the police do. So
if you didn't want to go that route, you would need to make some fairly significant changes to the ordinance. So to section 21-66, you would probably just say a person who violates this ordinance is guilty of a misdemeanor. And then that would be the end of section 21.66.
Okay.
And then you wouldn't need 21.6-67 either, because that would all be governed under normal confidentiality laws. And
okay, thanks.
What was your first amendment that you wanted to say?
To put in the
against their will.
Against the will part of 2263A. That's all I have.
So can I just ask a follow-up? So I just want to clarify this, because I had some of the same questions around the Human Relations Commission being the one to kind of investigate this. So it has to be one or the other. It either has to be criminal, like a misdemeanor, or civil.
You generally wouldn't want the Human Relations Commission investigating criminal offenses.
Correct. No, that I get, but I'm saying it's like there wouldn't be sort of, there's not, yeah, I guess I'm answering my own question. Never mind.
Okay.
Eric, you had some questions?
Yeah, a couple of questions. Is there, so viewing this as a public health issue, do we regulate public health in any other way? I'm not even sure if we had a health department, then I would ask them, but we don't have a health department, so I guess I'm asking the city manager.
I think that public health is an area we stay out of. Typically, it's an area the county is involved in the public health.
Could you speak up, sorry?
The city does not typically get involved. A city our size doesn't. There are larger cities that have Department of Public Health, but the city of East Lansing doesn't get involved at this level. Typically, the county would be county mental health, county public health, would be human services by a county. So.
And then a question for the city attorney. Could you address issues of litigation surrounding these sorts of ordinances?
Well, there have been a number of cases challenging these types of ordinances already. This is not a new ordinance. In fact, I believe this was drafted from another city that adopted one. There's been some success on the cities in defending these ordinances. But one of the concerning decisions was that one of the circuit courts, I think it was the 10th Circuit, upheld an ordinance of this nature, stating that this type of speech wasn't as protected as other types of speech because it had its own classification as professional speech. So they classified it as professional speech and then changed the level of scrutiny that it would come under a First Amendment challenge. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court, in another case, in an unrelated issue, recently said that with regard to that case, that decision said that they've never recognized that intermediate level of scrutiny for professional speech. So they didn't really directly overturn the case, but they indicated kind of publicly that they're not supportive of that classification of professional speech as a different standard of protected speech. So that seemed to indicate that if they did apply a strict scrutiny standard to it, they might not uphold an ordinance of this nature.
What would trigger potentially a lawsuit? So would there have to be attempted enforcement by the city to trigger a lawsuit potentially?
No. Someone, especially with speech issues, First Amendment rights, they can claim that they're affected by this because if they're licensed in the city of East Lansing and want to perform conversion therapy on patients, they could file a suit on that basis. Standing has been upheld for that very reason, that they simply want to, they affirmatively state that they want to engage in this practice and this law prohibits it.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
So, Tom, is there a way to think of this differently? So this is geared obviously at the providers. We're talking about minor children, and so there's sort of two parts to this story, right? Somebody is taking them to this therapist and forcing them, unless, for example, you're saying a patient goes and wants that. But so if we were to define this as an element of abuse, is there a way to get at it that way, and rather than having it be the provider, it's the parents or guardians that are sort of tasked with or forbidden from pursuing this for their kids, or coercing or forcing their children to go to something like this, and then having that be sort of defined? Is there a way to define our abuse statutes to do this?
I don't think that necessarily gets around the types of challenges that we've seen. It may add a few to try to prosecute the parents for bringing their child to a therapist with, their belief that something's wrong with their child, even though we all recognize that that's not true.
Because the idea is that the professional should sort of follow professional standards, and a parent
The
might
con-
say,
the
"Oh, I
concept
took 'em."
is that basically it's medical malpractice for a professional to engage in this type of conduct.
Okay.
So you should be allowed to legislate against the type of conduct because it is medical malpractice. Now, whether you could insert that same kind of value system on a parent, I think would be problematic.
Okay.
Okay, I've got a question that sort of flows from Councilmember Draham's question, because as I look at this, I'm wondering why we target providers. It would seem to me that what we've left is a giant loophole here, which is somebody who is not a licensed professional but bills themselves as a conversion therapist, which is not a licensed profession within the state of Michigan, and then travels around performing conversion therapy. We've kind of limited the impact to this to minors by licensed professionals as defined here, when the actual practice of conversion therapy could very well be done without ever coming in contact with a licensed provider. So why are we, when this was drafted, was there a particular reason why we didn't have this say, just simply say it shall be unlawful for any person?
I think part of that was the breadth again of the, well, first of all, that portion was in the ordinance that was previously drafted, that was given to me, and that's what they targeted. I'm assuming that for the same reasons we discussed earlier, that to the extent that you're going to try to limit anyone from telling people that, that they shouldn't, be gay or lesbian or queer or, transgender, I think you've got some freedom of speech issues. I think when you have been successful and the courts have been successful in defending these ordinances, it's because, again, they viewed it as medical malpractice as opposed to just simply a free speech issue. So that's where the courts have been able to uphold it. I think if you try to broaden that, who you're applying this to, I think you strengthen the arguments against it in the sense of from a free speech capacity, and hopefully people aren't taking their children to unlicensed therapists. But
Any other questions? Go ahead.
No, I don't have another question.
All right. Are there any other questions of Tom? None? Go ahead.
I'll make a motion to approve Ordinance 1467, an ordinance prohibiting the practice of conversion therapy. And
All right, is there a second to that motion?
I'll second.
Seconded by Councilmember Draheim, moved by Councilmember Stevens. You want to speak to it?
yes, just a couple of things. One, if the language regarding against their will is something the city attorney can provide, I'd be happy to add that in there.
Are you proposing an amendment?
Yeah, it'd be,
I would assume we would insert that right after the first gender identity statement, so it would read, a change in individual sexual orientation or gender identity against their will, and then go on to say, including efforts to change behaviors and.
so I'd like to offer that amendment.
Second.
Okay, and that's in 2164?
2263A.
Oh, okay.
Can you read it again, Tom?
The sentence would read, conversion therapy or reparative therapy means any practice or treatment that seeks to change an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity against their will, comma, including efforts to change behaviors or gender expressions, etc.
Okay, that motion has been moved and seconded, that amendment. Is there any discussion, further discussion on that? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. What's next?
So just to speak on my motion, I think this is an important thing to do. We're not the first city in Michigan to do it, and hopefully we will not be the last. And I think Pastor Miller, who came and spoke at the beginning of the meeting, highlighted things that we talk about in East Lansing, maybe some things that we take for granted that we think, no, this doesn't happen here. It couldn't happen here. We're a progressive community. But when a pastor's coming to us and saying she's getting a call every month with something similar, then we know that we're not all the way there. And I think that we've made a lot of really good strides in East Lansing towards equality and equity, especially in the past few years with forums and town halls and ordinances and apologies passed, but protections for those who are most vulnerable, especially minors in a situation where they don't have that choice. And these long-standing effects will haunt them for the rest of their lives. I think it's very important that we protect minors. This is not about somebody who is of age as an adult seeking out these practices on their own. They are about parents and providers telling LGBTQIA youth that they are not right in the head, that what they're doing is wrong and they need to change it. And I don't think that we should allow that in the city, which is why I proposed this ordinance. So I will look for support for it tonight.
All right, is there any other discussion? Did you have another amendment?
Yes, did you come up with my second amendment to change, to involve an actual
Yes.
investigation?
Section 21-66 would still say enforcement, and then it would say a violation of section 21-64 is a misdemeanor.
So instead of A, right, like all of that would be struck.
2166 A, B, C would be stricken, and 2167 would be stricken, and 2166 would say enforcement, and then say a violation of section 2164 is a misdemeanor.
I'd like to propose that as an amendment.
Okay.
I'll second
You
that amendment.
moved that?
Yes.
Okay, you moved that. Is there a second?
I second it.
Seconded. Any discussion on that?
Would you just want to, go ahead.
Yeah, so to speak to my amendment, I just want it to be, if it's going to be against the law, I want there to be some way to actually investigate it and do something about it, and have a real impact. Although I do think that's probably impossible anyway, but this would make it more likely.
All right, and just so I'm clear, Tom, this amendment would eliminate subsection capital letter A, correct?
Correct.
And subsections B and C.
Correct. And section 2167.
And 2167. Okay, so the motion really is to remove those and substitute the language that you read there. And that's your motion, and that's your second.
And I think we need to change 2165 to powers and duties, because that references that the Human Relations Commission's powers and duties are to receive investigative.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. That should all be moved up to what I said for 2166 should have been 2165.
Okay.
And then
Okay.
all of those.
And then everything else.
Okay, we understand it as a
Yeah.
friendly amendment
Yeah.
also?
Yeah, and I'll just agree. I mean, I think one of the discomforts I have is sort of this, is this a civil issue, or do we consider, I mean, in my view, I do look at this as a form of abuse, and I feel like at some point we need a more more teeth in the investigation if we're gonna really go down this route.
Okay, go ahead, Aaron.
I'd just like to say, happy to add more teeth to this ordinance, and I'm happy we're considering it tonight.
Right. Any other discussion? All in favor of the amendment indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Any other amendments? Did you have a third one? No? Okay. All right, we're back to the main motion. Go ahead.
Okay, so I don't think anybody who has spoken so far, including the people who were speaking about the profession, think that conversion therapy, which I think more of as aversion therapy, it's a way to make you hate yourself so you change, is anything other than abuse. Any kind of therapy or parenting that makes you hate yourself so you change, it can ruin a person's life. And I think that the intention behind this ordinance to do something about that is laudable, and I agree with the intention. My problem is that this would be an ordinance that we couldn't enforce. So if there was a complaint and the police were to investigate and they went to the child and said, did this happen? And the child said yes, and they go to the therapist, then there can be, that would proceed. But if there's another complaint or somebody says from the outside that this therapist is doing this, and the parents and the therapists won't talk, which they don't have to because these records are privileged, then we can't enforce it. And I don't want to have yet another ordinance that we can't enforce. And even though it seems petty, the cost of defending this ordinance that we can't enforce can be huge, because a group or any group that spreads hate, which unfortunately are getting to be stronger and stronger in our country, can just come to East Lansing and say, you're violating our speech, we're gonna file a lawsuit. They can find another hate group with a lot of money to bankroll their lawsuit, and we can be in yet another lawsuit that can cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars to defend. And I'm willing to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to keep children from being abused, but because this is almost impossible to enforce, I don't think it does that. So it makes me feel good, like my city wants to protect children, and I personally want to protect children, but I don't think it works. So for that reason, I propose an ordinance a resolution that states what we all think, but has no teeth, because it's hard to bite this. It's hard to actually get any teeth to do anything. So until this is against the law and is a state law or federal crime or is defined as child abuse, I don't think that the ordinance is the right way to go.
Okay, go ahead.
So I'm a little dicey because I have a question, but you mentioned
You
that
can ask him a question.
that other cities have passed these. You mentioned Huntington Woods that this is based on. How many other cities in Michigan have passed these? Do we know, or do we have a ballpark?
Ann Arbor is in the process of doing this as well.
Huntington Woods is what this is
I
based
believe
on.
Huntington Woods is the first.
So Ann Arbor actually might not approve it, when I was talking to a couple of their council people.
When I proposed this, they were in consideration. I actually do not know if they have approved it yet or not. I apologize.
Tom, to your knowledge, when you look at those cases, were any of those brought because a city actually attempted to enforce, like were criminal and or civil cases brought against any therapist, or were those all related to the policy themselves?
The ones I reviewed were persons claiming that this ordinance interfered with their free speech rights, potentially,
Okay.
as opposed to being prosecuted under its violation.
Yeah. Okay.
So I will say that
I share some of your concerns, Ruth. I don't feel as strongly that this couldn't be enforced. I think it could be enforced. I think there are a lot of, not a lot, but there are a handful of crimes that are challenging to investigate. There may not be physical evidence. There may be a he said, she said, and we may find ourselves in a situation where a child claims this happened and it's investigated and it can't, the therapist says, no, I didn't do that. The child says, yes, but then maybe a second complaint comes forward. I mean, this happens in sexual misconduct. It happens. And it can be frustrating, I'm sure, for detectives and prosecutors when it's hard to build that case. So I acknowledge that it's challenging, but I do think there could be examples where multiple people are coming forward about the same therapist, and a case could be built and prosecuted and enforced. So I don't think it's completely unenforceable. So I have a little less concern on that than you do. But But it would be challenging, and I think it does present some problems, and I certainly am nervous about some of the issues around the free speech side of this, but I think it could be done. And my guess is that because these are not cases that will be brought terribly often, I hope, that might make them more challenging, but hopefully this is a more prophylactic approach.
Go ahead.
Quick question for city attorney. Could somebody that's, say, 18, 19, after the fact, say that this happened to them when they were 16, could they bring a complaint forward after the fact?
Yes.
Okay. So in that case, because they would be an adult, the parent wouldn't be involved in that process, they would be bringing that complaint of their own volition?
They could waive the privilege on their own and bring a complaint on their own.
Sure. Thank you.
There's also the people who would comply with it just because it's against the law.
Right, of course.
A kid can also waive his privilege.
No, I understand that. I just, there was an example made where, parents have to get involved. Parents might say, no, that's not happening, or, and from experiences that people have talked to me about and others, oftentimes the kid in that situation doesn't know what's going on and doesn't know what their rights are. And, so after the fact is usually something that is used.
And just for clarification of that comment, this is a prospective ordinance, so they couldn't come back, and say 3 years ago they were under conversion therapy and have this ordinance apply. It only applies from its time of publishing going forward.
Okay. Yes, of course. Yeah.
Can I ask one question?
Go ahead.
So Tom, when you look at the definition of conversion therapy and think about, the quotes from this article, I've read some same things on, in my Google searches or whatever, but that second sentence about what conversion therapy shall not include, your interpretation of this is that if somebody is providing counseling to someone and they say, and they're counseling that child, maybe you aren't ready, and that child says, I want to start, I want to actually do a transition, or I want to do that, and they're kind of counseling them that maybe we need to be working on some other issues or making sure that you are fully exploring this. Like to me, this feels very broad, that as long as they're not saying to them, no, you're not gay, or no, you're not really a male, and we're going to make you feel, that a therapist who's trying to help a child understand where they are and what is going on in their world and sort of what that, is that considered neutral, gender neutral?
Yeah, I mean, the ordinance is designed to prohibit the counselor that tells the person what they should be and how they should behave.
Correct.
Rather than,
Yeah.
exploring and assisting someone who's having issues. So, are having, trouble finding out who they are. So it prevents the, the seeking to change their orientation as opposed to, seeking to help them with whatever
process they are
orientation
deciding
may
to
have.
go through or not, right? Okay.
So let's take a hypothetical situation, which actually is not that hypothetical. Let's say a Catholic church during a mass tells the people at the mass that there is a group in the hall that is willing to help people struggling with their sexual orientation, because the Catholic Church still believes that acting on, however discussing the way they put that is, your sexual orientation is a sin. Would that be considered a violation?
Not in that context, no.
Okay, because they haven't actually
They're not
hired a therapist to do it.
They're not providing the conversion therapy.
Okay, so that we probably wouldn't be open to the same kind of lawsuit we're in right now with the anti-gay Apple people, because they're using religious grounds as their defense.
Well, most of these challenges have been on First Amendment grounds, but there's a religious component to that as well. I mean, the fact that, they can't enforce their religious beliefs could easily be a part of a challenge.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
If there's a client-therapist interaction where the therapist is acting in a way that an objective observer would agree is more exploring sexuality as opposed to directing, but the client perceives it as directing, could that be the basis of a complaint?
Well, the basis of a complaint, the way the ordinance has been modified, it would have to be investigated by the East Lansing Police Department or some other police department. And like almost any situation, criminal case, I mean, there are the differing viewpoints of what actually happened, and that's up for the investigation to ferret out. And then once they do that, they would submit a report to our office, and we'd have to make a determination as to whether probable cause exists that a violation of the ordinance occurred. So, on the spectrum, you could find a number of cases that go along that the standard is that we have to have probable cause in order to issue a violation. If the therapist, explained to the officer that the patient misunderstood their treatment and that that's not what they were trying to do, we would probably have a difficult time issuing a complaint under that theory.
But there's still this possible scenario where a therapist who's trying to do the right thing finds himself talking to a police officer.
But that's a possibility. But I think that that's true with almost any profession.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in some ways I look at this as, given the challenges with enforcement, I look at this as it's almost like, the word backstop is going to sound so flippant, I don't mean it to, but it's on some potentially what might be more egregious, right? If there's a therapist in the community that is known to be doing this, and enough of a case is made, because maybe it's multiple complaints, or maybe it's privileges waived after the fact, it allows us to get at that. But I think in those cases where it's challenging and it's like, that's an enforcement issue, but it is like any other, like child abuse complaints and others where there sometimes isn't physical evidence, and there are these kinds of scenarios. And I think if this sort of backstops and prevents or addresses even a handful, or one, then, I think we've protected ourselves enough in here by having it be the medical malpractice side of this from litigation that I think I'm increasingly comfortable with.
I've got a question for you. The definition of conversion therapy doesn't make any reference to a minor. And I have a hard time believing that only minors have been subjected to conversion therapy. I know you used the Huntington Woods, I think it was Huntington Woods, right, version of this as the model here, but I guess I'm not clear on why we are leaving out adults who may be, because of one thing or another, subjected to conversion therapy against their will. So have you come across any cases that say, once you're an adult, anybody can do anything they want to you? Or what is the reason for this?
I think that there's a presumption that an adult will have control over what therapist they go to versus a minor. And I think the main concern is that minors are being directed to particular therapists by particular people. Obviously, I think that there's probably adults who may have a guardian or some person in control of their medical attention. And, that's a scenario where perhaps an ordinance might protect against some abuse on that level. So if you wanted to add persons under care of a guardian, or something like that, I think you could probably expand the ordinance to that type of level.
I think what the mayor's getting at is, in a therapeutic relationship, or in a doctor-patient relationship of a physical thing that you're dealing with, there can still be malpractice, whether you have a guardian or not. So if I go in to have my left leg operated on, they take my right leg off, that's against my will, because I want them to take my left leg off. But in this case, if I go to a therapist and I'm in the course of normal therapy, and that therapist decides to commit malpractice and start conversion therapy, that should be just as illegal no matter how old I am. So if we were to take age out of this completely, would that make it, it wouldn't weaken it, would it?
There's some of the case law that has supported these ordinances.
Because
Starts
they're
with,
minors.
we're balancing two of our, strong interests in the government, that one being the protection of minors, two being the freedom of speech. I think the protection of minors has been something that has helped these ordinances, when they have been sustained, be sustained.
So it'd be more likely to be overturned if we took that out.
I think anything you do to broaden the scope of the ordinance is going to make it more susceptible to an attack.
Okay, thank you. I won't propose that ordinance.
Okay, let me follow that up then. We're looking at 2263A, the definition of conversion therapy. Let's say I have a son who comes out, and that son is 13 years old, and I, as a parent, have a discussion with my son and talk about, you're just making a mistake, you're not really gay, you're this, that, and the other thing. This talks about any practice or treatment that seeks to change an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity. Is it fair to state that parent-child conversation, or however it could be characterized, would not be considered conversion therapy under this definition?
It might be under the definition, but it wouldn't be prohibited under 2164, which requires that which states it's unlawful for any provider to provide conversion therapy, and then provider is defined.
Okay, let's
as
assume
licensed
that
therapies.
2164A says no person shall, instead of provider. Does the parental activity violate the conversion therapy provision?
With that one comment, I don't know, but I mean, certainly a parent would be susceptible to violating the ordinance if they engaged in.
And that would be considered child abuse at that point under our ordinance, correct?
It would be considered a violation of this ordinance. I mean, we haven't named it child abuse. We've just made it a misdemeanor, so.
Okay, and your opinion is that that would weaken this ordinance and make it more likely to be overturned, or not?
I think anything you do to broaden the scope of the ordinance opens it up to additional challenges. So, I mean, and I understand the intent and desire to broaden the scope, and I understand the reasoning behind it. I just have to tell you, as the city's attorney, that when you do that, you open it up to other challenges, and the parent-child relationship and that bond there is, and how to raise your children is one of them. I mean, it's. I don't know that it's not widely recognized as child abuse yet. So I think that it should be, but it isn't, and because of that, you can face additional challenges.
Yeah, but I have the same problem, and I'm concerned about challenges, and I have the feeling this is going to pass, and I'm trying to protect the city from hundreds of thousands of dollars in lawsuits. But I think we are hypocritical to say it's okay if a parent does it, and it's a violation if a parent takes a child to a therapist to do it. We aren't allowed to raise children however we want. We're not the reason you have children is not so you can abuse them however you want. It's so you can raise them however you want without committing child abuse. And I would support an amendment that would make it unlawful for anyone, regardless of whatever, to do this.
Did you say yours?
No.
Yeah, so I don't think I will support that.
I'm not actually making the
Okay.
amendment. I was just talking about it.
I think this strikes a balance between those things, and maybe is a place for us to start as a pretty strong policy on this. I think the other reason I feel a little more comfortable with it is, to me, there is a, because I do think it's abuse. I do think it's abuse from a parent. I think you could have a church. There's all sorts of other things we can all imagine. I do think there is an attributed level of import that goes with seeing a doctor that a 13-year-old would feel that is different than maybe even their parent. Like the struggle between what they might feel with a parent and this mental health, havoc that could wreak in terms of not being accepted by their parent is devastating and could be, traumatic for their whole life. I think the difference between sort of actually believing when it's coming from a professional who is deemed a professional as a therapist has a different kind of damage. So I don't know, I guess I feel like this doesn't maybe go as far as we want, but gives us some of those protections against litigation and still provides some of that protection, because I think, it at least is taking that side of it out. The professional who is, cloaking themselves in medicine. I think we're all being, we're being sensitive right now to things that have happened in this town and on this campus recently, and what that means when you are cloaking yourself in a medical degree and a certificate on the wall. I think in theory I'd like it to be broader, but I'm not comfortable going there yet. So I'm not going to support something broader.
Okay, I've got another question for you then. Is there, I'm very troubled by the fact that we're leaving a loophole. And my question for you is there a way to phrase this that would capture that unlicensed individual who is out there performing conversion therapy as we have defined it here? A person who, as someone said at the microphone, there's a lot of hidden corners here, even in the city of East Lansing, that we can capture through some language change here that would make certain that we didn't leave that loophole in this ordinance.
Well, the concern is that conversion therapy is actually pretty broadly defined here. It says that any practice or treatment that seeks to change an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity. So going back to your parent example, if a parent expresses disappointment with a child's sexual orientation, that would be regarded by some, and probably the child, as an effort to change their gender expression or identity. Because of that kind of broad definition involved in this ordinance, because it is broadly drafted, I think the thing that makes it defensible is the fact that it's medical malpractice by a lot of boards and certifying agencies, state agencies. So there is that state support for a medical malpractice aspect, but there isn't going to be that for the general person who has certain beliefs about gender identity and so forth. So unless you want to narrow the definition of conversion therapy,
I really don't want to do that.
I didn't think so.
But I, alongside this is the fact that we then proceed to narrow it to providers and minors. And I still believe that there are vulnerable adults who would be subjected to this, and the only thing that escapes responsibility is that they're adults at this point. So my next question is there a way to include that category of individual in this ordinance?
I think if you define vulnerability in the sense that they have a guardian or appointed, somebody like that, so it's somebody where somebody has legitimate licensed control or court-ordered control over the person and the treatment that they get. Clearly, under those circumstances, you can do it. The problems come in, I think, when you go beyond that and talk about, just vulnerabilities and make it a vaguer term as to, when a person is vulnerable and when they're not. That's the problem is there's always a slope, and so unless you specify who those vulnerable people are, I think you've got, again, probably some other issues, vagueness issues, and other issues involved as well.
Okay, all right. All right, we're at the main motion with its amendments. Aaron?
I have just a couple more questions. Section 2164, B, it says any violation of subsection A is hereby declared to be a violation of the minor civil rights and a municipal civil infraction, with the violator subject to a penalty of $500 per offense. Should we change that because we had?
Yes, that should be deleted.
Okay, I will make an amendment to delete section 2164, subsection B.
Second?
Okay. Everybody understand that amendment?
Yes.
Okay, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
And my next
Please,
question is on section 2165, power and duties of the Human Relations Commission, because I believe we deleted it from section 2166 onward.
No, that was friendly amended to
okay,
delete
good.
that.
We already
All
did
right,
that.
so understood. Then I have no more amendments.
Okay. Go ahead, Eric.
So people do bad things to other people. We wish they didn't. We wish they could control those instances, but we can't. I think this discussion has made clear for me that the focus of this ordinance is essentially a public health issue. And we don't regulate public health. And I'm concerned about unintended consequences. There are I can imagine conversations happening between a client and a therapist that could approach potentially a violation. And if I'm a therapist, I'm not necessarily going to want to approach a violation, so I'm going to change the way I approach my therapy, even if it's perfectly legitimate. If we had a health department, I would ask for an analysis by our subject matter experts on whether that's an issue. We don't have a health department. There are actually some medical practices in East Lansing that I abhor, where people get tricked into believing they're going to get some sort of feedback when they walk through the door of this establishment, and then they get a different kind of feedback. I would like to ban those too, but I don't think we should, because we don't regulate health, public health. So I think this is outside our wheelhouse. I want to emphasize I support our civil rights ordinance because it essentially says it governs behavior, it doesn't govern belief. So our civil rights ordinance says that you can hate whoever you want, but if you discriminate against people in your general business practices, then you don't get to do business with the city, you don't get to sign contracts with the city, and I think that's completely appropriate. I would feel uncomfortable if we were doing business, if the city were doing business with people who discriminated in their general business practices. I realize this is not about me and my discomfort level, but I think that's an important and appropriate stance to take. But I view this as different. I think this issue is outside our wheelhouse. I don't feel comfortable. I don't think there's been enough domain expertise that has been part of this discussion for me to feel comfortable that there aren't unintended consequences. This is just not in our wheelhouse, so I can't support the ordinance.
Any other discussion? All right, I'm not going to respond to that, but I will note that, I think some of the changes here have moved us further along. I'm not going to vote against the ordinance. I am still concerned that there's a big loophole out here that is very difficult for us to get our arms around, given the language, sort of a language barrier. We probably could write 15 paragraphs to finally get to where we are, but this is not probably the time to do it. But I'd like us to continue to look at a way to protect all of our citizens with regard to this, because I do not believe that is limited to minors in our community. And I realize that, the more broadly we state this, the more likely it is that we would end up with litigation that could blow the whole thing out. So I'm good with going forward with what we have right now, especially with the changes that Councilmember Byer suggested here. But I want us to keep looking at this, and I hope the Human Relations Commission will look at it and try to find some evidence that might help us find the right language to capture every vulnerable adult, not just minors that are in our community. And when I say vulnerable adult, I've had cases involving psychiatrists and psychologists who took advantage of their clients. Those are vulnerable adults. And this activity could be just as easily imposed on a vulnerable adult who comes in for appropriate reasons for psychiatric or psychological counseling. So I'd like to get us there at some point, so I don't think this is the end result. I hope this isn't the end result of our efforts with regard to this. So.
Mark, just a tiny side note off of that, I think the mayor highlights exactly why this is important and exactly what I think the Human Relations Commission and I think what the city stands for, which is a constant strive for equity and equality, because the work is never done, and this is certainly not the last you'll hear on this issue in the city of East Lansing. So,
okay, any other discussion? All right, all in favor of the ordinance indicate by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay, the motion carries 3-2. There was also a resolution. Do you want to propose that?
No, I think the resolution is actually in the first paragraph of the ordinance that we just adopted, so I think it would just be redundant at this point.
Okay. All right, the next item on our agenda is adjournment. So we are adjourned. Thank you all for coming this evening.